Please welcome the president of Stony Brook University, Maurie McInnis.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Stony Brook University's presidential lecture in conjunction with the Gujavarty Seminar on Leadership and Values, featuring eminent economist Raj Chetty. It is my pleasure to be together in person with many of our students, faculty, staff, and members of our local community. We are also pleased that we have guests joining us on live stream as well. As we begin the evening, I'd like to recognize special guests in our audience this evening: Dr. Nirmal Mattoo, a Stony Brook Foundation trustee, and his wife, Tina, as well as S.N. Sridhar, the founding director of the Mattoo Center for India Studies. I would also like to express our appreciation for Dr. Krishna Gujavarty for his vision in establishing the Gujavarty Endowed Seminar on Leadership and Values. Since 2014, yes. Since 2014, this seminar has sought to foster values-based leadership among our students by providing them an opportunity to learn from the vision, strategies, insights, and experience of thought leaders across a wide range of fields, including politics, education, healthcare, and journalism. The Stony Brook campus community has certainly been looking forward to Professor Chetty's return to our university. And yes, I did say return. Tonight is not his first visit to Stony Brook. We have a photo that's supposed to go up. There we go. This photo shows a very young, soon-to-be Professor Chetty as a young boy in the late 1980s when his father, V. Rupra Chetty, was a visiting professor in Stony Brook's Department of Economics. In a conversation a few weeks back with Professor Chetty, he mentioned that Professor Yair Tauman and Professor Pradeep Dubey, current faculty members of our econ department, were some of his father's colleagues and friends. And I'm pleased that Professor Dubey is in our audience tonight. So a little round of applause for him as well. And it's really great to have the worlds of Stony Brook, past and present, connect in this special way tonight. Raj Chetty is the William A. Ackman Professor of Public Economics at Harvard University and Director of Opportunity Insights. In a long list of accolades, I will mention a few here. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the recipient of both the MacArthur Genius Grant and the John Bates Clark Medal, awarded annually to the top economist under 40. While at Stanford University in 2017, Professor Chetty authored the now famous research study on intergenerational mobility that ranked Stony Brook University as a leader among highly selective public universities in the nation. Leveraging de-identified IRS tax returns of parents and combining them with college enrollment and income data of their children, he created a social mobility index. This index, as we've talked about on many occasions, measures how well a university is doing with regard to enrolling a high share of students from low-income communities, and then equipping them with the knowledge and skills such that a high proportion of them move into the top 20% of their peer incomes by the time they're in their 30s. Tonight, we are looking forward to the insights he will share about his continuing research on social mobility, as well as his personal story and trajectory as a scholar and researcher. Professor Chetty's work at Opportunity Insights brings together academic research with scalable solutions. The goal is to influence policymakers and enable more people to move out of poverty. Please join me in welcoming Raj Chetty to begin the conversation this evening.
Thanks so much, President McInnis, for the very warm introduction. It's really a pleasure to be back here at Stony Brook after many, many years. And really a privilege and an honor to be at an institution that, as I will discuss today, I think is playing a key role in providing pathways to the American dream for many, many people. So I want to talk today about how we can make changes in our own communities and our own institutions to increase economic opportunity. But I want to start at a much bigger picture level by talking about the American dream, which is, of course, a multifaceted, complex concept that can mean different things to different people. But I want to distill it in this first chart here to a simple statistic that I think is a cornerstone aspect of the American dream, certainly something that drew my own parents to this country, and I suspect many of you. The idea that America at least aspires to be a place where, through hard work, any child can go on to have a higher standard of living than their parents did. So in a paper my colleagues and I wrote a few years ago, we set about to assess the extent to which America actually lives up to that aspiration, measuring the fraction of children who go on to earn more than their parents did, measuring both kids' and parents' incomes in their mid-30s and adjusting for inflation. And we're looking at that data in this first chart here by the year in which the child was born, all the way back on the far left, looking at children born in the middle of the last century, where you can see that for kids born at that time, it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of moving up relative to your parents. 92% of children born in 1940, by our calculations, went on to earn more than their parents did. But if you look at what has happened over time, you can see that there's been a dramatic fading of the American dream, such that for children born in the middle of the 1980s, who are turning 30 around now when we're measuring their incomes as adults, it's become essentially a 50-50 shot, a coin flip as to whether you're going to achieve the American dream. So this trend is, of course, of great interest to economists like myself because it reflects a fundamental change in the US economy that we'd like to understand. But I would argue it's also a fundamental political and social interest because I think it's this very trend that underlies a lot of the frustration that people around the United States are expressing, that this is no longer a country where it's easy to get ahead, even through hard work, and that's reflected in recent electoral outcomes and so forth. So motivated by this trend, in our research group at Harvard Opportunity Insights, we're focused on the big picture question of what is causing the fading of the American dream, and how can we restore the American dream going forward. Now that's, of course, a question that lots of people have been interested in for decades. Many social scientists have been trying to understand the determinants of inequality and opportunity. Our angle on it, and the research that I'll share in the next half hour or so with you, is to use the tools of modern big data to study these sorts of questions. So much as we hear a lot about big data in the private sector, companies like Amazon and Google seeking to improve the products they offer by analyzing large data sets, our vision is that such data can help us better understand important economic and social policy questions. One of the great benefits of that sort of data is that you can go beyond the national picture that we're looking at here and start to disaggregate the data in much finer ways to understand the determinants of mobility and what kinds of changes we might want to make from a policy perspective to make improvements, expand opportunity going forward. So one first form of disaggregation, breaking down the data that's very useful, is to look at things from a geographic perspective. And so to do that, let me turn to this map here, which shows you the geography of upward mobility within the United States. I'll first describe how we construct this map, and then tell you what I think we learned from it. So what we did here is took data from tax records, anonymized tax returns, covering 20 million children, essentially all children born in the United States in the early 1980s. We linked them to their parents and mapped them back to the place in which they grew up. We then divide the US into 740 different metro and rural areas. And in each of those areas, we calculate a simple measure of upward mobility. We follow these kids over time, and we ask for the children who were growing up in low-income families, that is, families making $27,000 a year, which puts you at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution. What are you yourself earning as an adult when we're measuring your income using your own tax returns at age 35? We color the map so that red-orange colors represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility, where kids growing up in these low-income families are less likely to rise up, and blue-green colors are places where kids growing up in comparably low-income families are achieving higher levels of income in adulthood. If you start by just looking at the scale in the lower right-hand side of this chart, you can see that even in the 1980s, at which point, when the nation as a whole, as I just showed you in the first slide, it looked like the American dream had faded. Even for the kids born at that time, there are some places, like much of the center of the country, for example, where kids growing up in low-income families still have a terrific chance of rising up. So take a place like Dubuque, Iowa, for instance, or much of the rural Midwest. Kids growing up in families making $27,000 a year, one generation later are making $50,000 or more on average. So quite a substantial amount of upward mobility in a single generation. But on the other hand, if you look at places like Charlotte, North Carolina, or much of the Southeast, places in the industrial Midwest like Cincinnati and Cleveland, you can see that kids starting out in families at the exact same income level, $27,000 a year, one generation later are actually in some cases making less than their parents were on average, which is remarkable given the tremendous amount of economic growth that has occurred in the US over the past 30 years, and in particular in places like Charlotte, which is one of the booming cities in the US. So this data, I think, is of interest to us for two reasons. First, from a scientific perspective, this kind of analysis can give us a new tool to understand the science of economic opportunity. I think where we are in the field of economics, to make an analogy, is similar to when the compound microscope was discovered, was invented in biology, where we could start to look at things at a much finer level. Analogously, in economics, from an empirical perspective, while we've made great theoretical advances over many decades in terms of studying which theories are correct and estimating key parameters, we've lacked the data to be able to do that with precision. And these kinds of data, where we can start to really break things down much more finely, can give us a new lens to study these issues. So in particular, you can start to ask, what is it that's different about Iowa versus Ohio? What is it that's different about Cincinnati versus Salt Lake City? And what happens, for example, when a child moves from Salt Lake City to San Francisco? Do we see their outcomes changing and so forth? And that kind of analysis can help us get a much richer picture of the determinants of economic opportunity. So that's from a scientific point of view. From a policy perspective, if we can discover what's driving these differences, the hope is we can then start to make changes in the red-colored parts of this map to try to increase economic opportunity there and potentially increase economic mobility in the nation as a whole. So with that vision, over the past several years, our research team has basically been trying to understand what is driving the variation that we're seeing in this map. We've done a series of different studies exploring the role of many different factors, things like racial disparities, historical factors, the causal effects of growing up in one neighborhood versus another, drilling down at a much finer level, not just this metro area level analysis, but looking across different neighborhoods, within New York City, for example. In the interest of time here, I'm going to distill what we found at a very broad level into some of the key factors that we've found to be predictive of these differences in mobility across areas. To be clear, each of these domains, there's now a subfield investigating them, and one could give an entire talk or two on each of these different buckets, but just let me give you a high-level summary. And then given this audience and the setting we're in, I'm going to focus in particular on the role of higher education. But just briefly summarizing at a higher level first before I zoom in to the role of education, if you look in the data and ask, what is it that's systematically different about the places that have high levels of economic mobility and low levels of economic mobility, you will find that the places in the blue-green colors on the map that I just showed you tend to be places with lower poverty rates. They're places where low-income people and high-income people are living in proximity to each other, where black people and white people are living in proximity to each other. They tend to be places also with more stable family structures. So it's a strong pattern in the data that places with more two-parent families tend to have higher rates of upward mobility. Third, you find that places with greater social capital, in particular greater levels of interaction between low and high-income people, tend to have higher levels of economic mobility. In fact, one of our most recent studies uses data from Facebook to measure the degree of interaction between people at different income levels. And that turns out to be an incredibly strong predictor of economic mobility. If you live in a place as a low-income person where you have many higher-income friends, a community that's connected in that way tends to have high levels of economic mobility. And finally, as you might expect intuitively, and what I'm going to focus on here, Places with better access to both K through 12 elementary education and access to higher quality higher education tend to be places with higher levels of upward mobility. So there are a variety of different factors that seem to matter. There are a series of studies that have been done, both correlational and using randomized experiments or quasi-experimental methods, that really seem to establish these factors as being quite important in driving economic mobility. So in light of that body of research, what I want to focus on here is what that means for how we can increase economic mobility going forward. And in our group, we're basically organizing our thinking around 3 different directions. So in a nutshell, to summarize what we've learned from many, many research studies over the past decade or so using these sorts of data in our research team and many, many other scholars, economic mobility is heavily driven by the environment in which children grow up, from something like birth to roughly age 20 or 22. And what matters is the context in which you're growing up, who you're connected to, what the schools look like, and so forth. All right? So if you have that view of the world, that economic mobility is heavily shaped by local environment, there are 3, I think, natural ways that you would think about trying to increase economic opportunity going forward. So first, I haven't shown you this data, but it turns out that the type of variation that I was illustrating in the national map, there's a lot of variation, even within cities. In one part of New York, Queens versus another borough, you see very different levels of economic mobility. And so often you can go 2 miles down the road within a given city, and you have much greater chances of rising up in the income distribution if you're growing up in that neighborhood instead of another place. And so motivated by that, one approach you might think about to increasing economic opportunity is simply to reduce segregation or help more low-income families move to high opportunity areas. And that motivates a set of potential reforms in the context of affordable housing, housing vouchers, zoning laws, lots of things that we can discuss in greater length if folks are interested when we get to the discussion. But that's one area of focus. A second area of focus, recognizing that you can't possibly move everyone and not everyone wants to move, is to think about how you can bring opportunity to the red-colored parts of the map that I've been showing you. How do you make place-based investments to change the school system there or to change other kinds of resources, mentoring programs, other things that might change the trajectory of lives in a given neighborhood. Finally, recognizing that the key touch point for most kids after age 18 is not the house in which they're growing up, but the institution of higher education that they may be attending. I think there's a big role that institutions of higher education like this one can play in increasing economic mobility. And given our setting this evening, I'm going to focus in more detail on that particular domain here in the rest of this talk. So first, to set the stage, I'm going to start by talking about some data from the study that President McInnis mentioned, which we initially released back in 2017, where we look at the role of colleges in economic mobility in a detailed way. But I'm going to start with just a very simple fact before we get to specific colleges, Stony Brook versus other colleges and so on, just who is going to college in America, any college at all. So let's plot your college attendance rate versus your parents' household income. This is again using income data from tax records linked to Department of Education data on college attendance records for 30 million students. So think of this as a very comprehensive, precise analysis of college attendance patterns in the US. And you can see first, that there's an incredibly strong gradient in terms of college attendance rates with respect to parent income. If you're born to parents at the top of the income distribution, so like in the top 1%, that far right dot there. So just to be clear, what we're doing here is dividing the parental income distribution into 100 percentiles. There are 100 dots here, and just plotting the fraction of kids who go to college within each of those bins. If you happen to be born to parents in the top 1% of the income distribution, virtually 100% chance you're going to go to college in the US. If you happen to be born to parents at the bottom of the income distribution, only a 30% chance you're going to go to college. So that very fact, I think a lot of us have the sense that going to college is a key stepping stone to achieving economic success, life success in many other domains. This itself is going to create an enormous divide to begin with in terms of intergenerational mobility and opportunities for kids growing up in low-income families. But actually, it turns out, I think the problem is even deeper than that, because it's not just whether you go to college or not that varies with parental income, it's which college you go to. So to get at that, and that's really what we were able to do with these data for the first time, I want to turn to this chart here, which I'm going to use as the key visual representation in the rest of the talk to show you the role of colleges in terms of how they influence economic mobility. So let me walk you through how we set this up, starting with one specific college in the New York area. Let's take Columbia University, right? Elite, highly selective private college. We're going to think about what Columbia contributes to economic mobility in the United States on two dimensions. On the vertical axis here is a measure of upward mobility for the students who attend Columbia. So what we're asking here is, suppose you take the set of kids who come from low-income families, families in the bottom 20% of the income distribution. What fraction of those kids after college, when we measure their incomes in their 30s, have reached the top 20% of the income distribution? So in a sense, this is a measure of what fraction of kids at Columbia are achieving the American dream of rising from the bottom to the top. Columbia looks quite good on that dimension. 60% of the kids who started out in the bottom 20% end up reaching the top 20% or even beyond. So the majority of kids who are starting out in these quite low-income families are reaching the upper middle class or well beyond that. So on that dimension, it looks like Columbia is doing a terrific job in terms of promoting upward mobility. But of course, if you think about it, your total contribution to economic mobility depends not just upon how the low-income kids on your campus are doing, but how many of those low-income kids you actually have on your campus to begin with. And on that dimension, Columbia does not look so great. If you look at what fraction of the children at Columbia come from families in the bottom 20%, which is what is on the horizontal axis here, you can see that only 3 or 4% of children come from the bottom 20% at Columbia. And you see similar statistics at other elite private colleges as well. So to give you, one similar statistic from Harvard, my own institution, you're about 80 times more likely to attend Harvard if you happen to be born to parents in the top 1% of the income distribution than if you happen to be born to parents in the bottom 20%. So when you have that kind of skewness in terms of who is attending these colleges to begin with, it's basically mechanically impossible that they're contributing a whole lot to economic mobility because they're not serving many low-income kids to begin with. Okay, so I've shown you the data specifically here for Columbia. Now let me contrast that with Stony Brook. So Stony Brook, as you're all well aware, has a significantly more diverse student body with nearly 20%, something like 17% of kids coming from the bottom 20%, which is remarkable, especially given the fact that I showed you initially that many low-income kids don't go to any college at all. So the fact that you have nearly 20% of the student body coming from the bottom 20%, I think is a reflection of the diversity of this institution. What's more, if you look at the outcomes at Stony Brook, what fraction reach the top 20%, they actually don't look all that different from Columbia. Maybe something like 50% of kids are reaching the upper middle class as opposed to the 60% that you see at Columbia, okay? So in that sense, it looks like Stony Brook might be contributing significantly more to economic mobility than places like Columbia because it's serving a more diverse student body with quite good outcomes. So I've shown you a contrast here for two particular colleges. Now let's introduce all the other colleges in America to get a bit of a broader context and understand the issues in the US higher education system more broadly. So every dot here represents a different college in America. And so what you can see here, I think, is a striking pattern, which is we basically seem to have two types of colleges in America. We have some colleges, which are like Columbia or other peer Ivy League, highly selective private colleges that are kind of clustered in the upper left. They offer terrific pathways in terms of upward mobility. If you attend those colleges, you have great outcomes after attending those colleges. Those colleges basically cater to the rich. They have very few low-income students, despite many efforts, and I should be clear, it's not like people at those universities are not interested in addressing this problem. People have thought about these issues for the past decade or two and expanded financial aid and thought about lots of efforts to address this issue. But nevertheless, we're in this situation where they have predominantly high-income student bodies. And then on the other side, you have a set of colleges that do cater to many low-income students, typically two-year colleges or community colleges, which have many, many low-income students. But unfortunately, if you look at the outcomes at those colleges, Many students are not graduating. You don't see great outcomes at a number of those colleges. And so those colleges are also not contributing a whole lot to economic mobility because the outcomes don't look so great. So if you think about it conceptually, what you need in order to have a higher education system that promotes economic mobility effectively is having lots of dots in the upper right side of this figure. And that's basically vacant. It's basically empty in the US. That's, I think, the core of the problem. So what are the colleges in America that have the highest rates of economic mobility, that do the best job of combining a diverse student body with pretty good outcomes after college? So here we're just highlighting what some of those colleges are. They're the farthest to the upper right, basically. They have the highest mobility rates in the sense that they're moving the most kids from the bottom to the top of the distribution. And so just to see that in a list form, so you can get a sense of what those institutions are, you have Stony Brook, you have other places like the CUNY system, other what I would basically classify as mid-tier public institutions, often not the state flagship institutions. Notice you don't see the UC Berkeley's, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, et cetera, on this list. Because those colleges actually do not have many low-income students, even though they have terrific outcomes. So at these colleges, like take Cal State LA or Stony Brook, so that 8.4% number, what does that mean? It means that if you have 100 kids, take 100 kids on the Stony Brook campus, roughly 8.5 of them will have experienced the American dream in the sense that they come from a low-income family and end up in the top 20% of the income distribution. So that's a remarkable fraction of people moving from the bottom to the top. That compares with the average college in the US, where we have only a 1.9% mobility rate. And that's for two different reasons, as I was just laying out. Some of these colleges have terrific outcomes, but don't have many low-income students, and some of them have the converse issue. So having kind of diagnosed what the issues are, let me spend the last few minutes here talking about what we might do going forward at US higher education institutions in general, and perhaps at places like Stony Brook in particular. So the way I think about it, basically comes back to this figure. How do you get more dots in the upper right of this figure? Well, there are two ways you can think about it. One strategy is to take those dots that are in the upper left and move them to the right. So what does that amount to? Expanding low-income access at highly selective colleges where we currently have excellent outcomes. So you might wonder, take a place like Harvard or Yale, for example, is this really something that's feasible for them to do? Is it really in their hands? Or is it that so many disparities have emerged by age 18 that you can't feasibly admit more low-income kids, at that point because they haven't had access to the same schools, they haven't had access to the same resources. If you're trying to run a highly selective institution that's taking the most qualified children, maybe there's just a constraint on how many low-income kids you can get. So this is the kind of question our current research is trying to address. And just to give you a sense of why I think there is something colleges can do, let me turn to this chart here, where we're going to link in data now on SAT and ACT scores for everyone in America to the tax records and to the college attendance data that we were using before. And using that data, we can use SAT scores as a rough measure of pre-college qualification. So we can say, take a set of kids, all of whom have an SAT score of, say, 1,500, okay? So in some sense, they're at an equal point at the point of college admissions in terms of their preparation, their qualifications. Now let's look at the fraction of kids who are attending one of those Ivy League colleges in the upper left of that cluster I showed you, by parent income. And what you can see here is that even among the kids who have exactly the same SAT score, kids from the very richest families are far more likely to be attending these colleges than kids from lower income families and even kids in the middle class. So this suggests to me, and we're going to be doing more work on this, some of which we'll release publicly this summer, that there is something colleges might be able to do to make this curve flatter. It's not just that there's no kid from a low-income family who's scoring in the 1,500 range on the SAT. For some reason, those kids are getting in or attending at much lower rates. Maybe they're not applying, they're not choosing to join because of financial aid issues or other things. it suggests that there's something that's in the domain of higher education that can potentially be changed. So what might that look like? I think there are a number of different possibilities. Let me give you one example of a program that I think is making some difference. So this is drawing on some work by my colleague at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard, Sue Dynarski, who helped conduct a very innovative program at the University of Michigan, which I mentioned to you previously, looks a lot like Harvard in terms of its outcomes and the fraction of low-income students. So what they did is basically sent out mailers to high-achieving low-income kids, so kind of a big data approach. In Michigan, everyone is mandated to take the SAT. So they take that data, find the set of kids who scored high on the SAT, come from a low-income family, and they do targeted outreach to those children and say, we think you could do really well at the University of Michigan. You may not know, but you're eligible for a full scholarship, and we think you can really excel. They do some personalized outreach and so forth, really try to encourage these kids to apply and come to U of M. In practice, a lot of those kids otherwise would just go to the local community college, et cetera. They show with a randomized experiment that increases enrollment rates at the University of Michigan from 12% for that population up to 27%. And our sense is that's going to significantly expand the opportunities those kids have in the years to come and help flatten that curve that I was showing you a little bit. So I'm not saying this is the only thing one can do to try to remedy the situation. And this summer, when we release this new study, we'll identify a number of other things that I think could be relevant as well. But it shows you one way in which we can make a difference. So that's one strategy. A second strategy is focusing on these dots here in the lower right, where you have a number of colleges that are already serving many low-income students. So that's great. But the outcomes don't look so good. So there you want to do something different to try to improve outcomes at those institutions. And again, to give you an example of the type of thing that works, some of you, in the New York area here might be familiar with this program called Accelerated Study in Associate Programs, ASAP at CUNY, which is kind of a support program for kids once they're on campus to connect them with mentors, to provide additional advising, to provide a little bit of financial assistance if they face an income shock and are not able to pay their tuition or need some additional support. So think of it as kind of not just bringing you on campus and kind of saying, good luck, here's the course catalog, find your way, but really trying to shepherd you through the process. And again, in a randomized trial, quasi-experimental type of design, there's a study that's shown that this program, which is relatively inexpensive, doubles graduation rates at CUNY and can thereby significantly potentially improve impacts and economic success at those kinds of colleges. So again, I think a tangible thing that we can do to shift those dots upward. One example of many such programs that might be feasible going forward. So I've focused on these issues from the lens of how we can improve equity and expand opportunity. I want to end here by making one final point. So at an institution like this, where I think there are goals in terms of serving society and increasing economic mobility, but also being a pioneering research institution, I want to emphasize that increasing equality of opportunity is not just a matter of justice, but I think also a matter of improving welfare for everyone in society. And so to show you that, I just want to illustrate that point with data from a different study, where we look at patterns of innovation in the US by linking information from the universe of patent records as a simple marker of who innovates to the tax data. So we're able to look at who goes on to become an inventor in America. Here we're plotting your probability of becoming an inventor, that is having a patent, versus parent income. And you can see once again, if you happen to be born to rich parents, you're far more likely to become an inventor in America than if you happen to be born to lower income parents. And we go on to show that it's because of the set of factors that I've been discussing related to what you're exposed to in childhood, the environment you're growing up in, so forth and so on. The consequence of that is a phenomenon that we call lost Einsteins. We estimate, based on this analysis, that if women, kids from underrepresented minority backgrounds and low-income families were to invent at the same rate as high-income white men currently do, we'd have 4 times as many inventors in America as we currently do. And so that, of course, would benefit those kids themselves, but it would also tremendously benefit all of the rest of us with new drugs, new discoveries, new technologies that could potentially improve human welfare quite a bit. And so in that sense, I think these issues that are being tackled very effectively at Stony Brook, and I think could be tackled more effectively at college campuses across the US, are extremely important, not just from the perspective of justice, but improving welfare overall for everyone. So let me end. I've focused here on data for the United States in particular, which is where we're able to do a lot of these studies with this data that's just become available that our team has been developing. But of course, these issues are not unique to the US, and particularly recognizing the context that we're in here with the Mattoo Center and a number of folks from the South Asian community. I want to show this data here for India, where some of my students have now started to do this type of work in other countries around the world. And this is some work done by Sam Asher and Paul Novosad, starting to map economic opportunity in India, where, similar to what I was showing you with that initial map in the US, red colors are places where people growing up in low-income families in India are less likely to rise up. Green colors are places where they're more likely to rise up. And I'll just point out, reflecting on my own personal experience, my parents come from Tamil Nadu, which is the state in the southernmost part of India here. And you can see that that happens to be one of the darkest green colored parts of the map, one of the highest upward mobility places in the US, and that's certainly their own experience, growing up in very low-income families and villages in Tamil Nadu, were able to rise up, come to the United States to get a higher education at state institutions, places like the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is where my dad did his PhD, my mom her medical training. And to me, that my personal experience in that way very much resonates with everything that I've been sharing here, that I think this is exactly the reason I'm standing in front of you today, because of those opportunities that they had there. So it's a real privilege to be here, and I look forward to the conversation with President McInnis. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Professor Chetty. As always, you give us a lot to think about. And what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask Professor Chetty a number of questions, some of which came from audience members who submitted them beforehand. And then we'll also have some time for some live Q&A as well. So let's just start with some very personal histories and tie-ins to Stony Brook. So given that tonight's event was co-sponsored by our Mattoo Center for India Studies, and we're one of the only a few universities in the nation with an endowed professorship in Tamil, we'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about your own roots and how you think your family's story that you were just sharing a little bit about and your experience as an immigrant have maybe informed your own research interests.
Yeah, thanks. So, I think my own interest in these topics very much comes from my own childhood experience. So just to share a bit more on that, as I said, my parents grew up in villages in South India. And at the time, as some of you might know, there were many kids in their families. And because a lot of families didn't have enough money to educate all of their kids, they would choose one of the kids to get higher education. And so happened my dad was the one chosen in his family to complete high school, go on to college, eventually come to the United States to do a PhD. And quite unusually, my mom was the one chosen in her own family. And it's atypical at the time because women were not typically given access to higher education. My mom had older brothers. Turned out my maternal grandfather was a progressive thinker, was a freedom fighter alongside Mahatma Gandhi and others. And so he really believed in women's education. So my mom went on to become the first doctor in our community in South India. And so that, I think, has really shaped my own experiences because I've seen over the years how the opportunities I've had relative to my cousins, whose parents did not get those educational opportunities, over the generations, just had dramatically different opportunities for us. And I've often wondered, why is that the case? We all have similar genetics, obviously. A number of us actually have the same name. We're all named Raj after my maternal grandfather. And that's been in my mind and kind of thinking about what's driving that. And then at a more prosaic level, growing up here in the US, seeing the tremendous differences between India and the United States, getting interested over time in things like math and statistics, and realizing that this might be a set of questions I could answer with those tools. I think that's what led me to these issues.
Yeah, that's great. Obviously, we love that you've helped us understand higher education in a way that I think many of us didn't see, right? So your study has changed the conversations we're having in higher education and really thinking about our roles. And you were talking a lot about the percentage differences. There's also just the numeric differences, right? The public institutions tending to be so much larger that in fact a high percentage, when you also have a lot of students, really, you're having that impact on so many more lives. And I know at Stony Brook University how many of us are so motivated by and feel so good about the role that we have in educating students. But I think some of your other studies, shifting a little bit from this just to those things that make a difference, right? I think some of your other studies have pointed out that having a good teacher even early in life can have such a big difference on lifetime earnings. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you've found education more broadly and the impact it can have?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I think about it is that it's sort of a pipeline that starts at birth, or maybe even a little bit before birth. Prenatal factors might matter, all the way to early adulthood. And that entire pipeline matters in terms of how well kids do in the long run. And so to take an example, one of the early studies we did was looking at how the kindergarten teacher you have ends up affecting how much you're earning when you're 30 years old. And again, it's the power, methodologically of big data, being able to follow people over 25 years with tax records linked to early childhood education records, where you can see which teacher a child had, what classroom they were in, and so on. And, the punchline of that work is if you happen to, by chance, get a better teacher, a teacher who's more experienced, or a teacher who, this literature, people use a concept called value added. How much value is the teacher adding as measured by things like performance on standardized tests? If you happen to get a high quality teacher and I happen to get a low quality teacher, we can measurably see 20 years later, you're more likely to go to college than I am, and 30 years later, you're earning more than I am. And so, sometimes parents tell me, you're stressing me out with all these studies that you do. But the way I look at it is, there are lots of these individual level draws. It's not like it determines your fate. Each thing kind of adds up. And kids from higher income backgrounds get a lot more of those positive draws on average than kids from lower income backgrounds.
Yeah. So you've amassed and analyzed, hundreds of millions of data points that relate to social mobility. And I know you're really interested in figuring out how do you not only understand it, but how do we get policymakers and decision makers to make changes so that you can have an impact. And I'd be interested in hearing your sense of how your work has had an impact on whether it's nonprofits or governmental and policymakers in changing the ways that they're doing some of their work.
Yeah, and so that's certainly a goal, and I appreciate having opportunities like this and folks like yourself who are interested in making a difference on these issues, and I think are in a position to do so. Let me give a couple of examples, outside the higher education context as well, where sometimes students especially will ask me when I'm teaching a class about these issues, or other folks in the public, you do all this research, but in this politically polarized time, does it actually make a difference? Does anyone change what they're doing when you present this evidence, no matter how clear it might be? And I've actually been quite encouraged, I have to say, surprisingly so. So let me give you some examples. So I didn't present this work in detail, but one of the things we show is the precise neighborhood in which someone's growing up can make a big difference in terms of how well they're doing in adulthood. And if you look at existing affordable housing programs in the US, we spend about $45 billion per year on providing affordable housing. And it turns out if you look at where that affordable housing is, a lot of it is through housing vouchers that families can use through what was called the Section 8 program to rent housing wherever they would like. Most of those vouchers are being used in low opportunity areas, despite getting this assistance from the government. families are not moving to neighborhoods where we can see in the data their kids would thrive. And so when we noticed this pattern, we were puzzled by it. People in the Housing and Urban Development Agency, which administers this program, they were puzzled by it and so on. And so we teamed up to set up a pilot study in Seattle where we provided 1,000 families coming in to receive these housing vouchers additional assistance to move to high opportunity areas if they wanted to do so. And this was set up as a randomized trial to see, could you, by providing a little bit of additional support, make these vouchers much more effective in helping families move to areas where we know their kids would rise up. Turns out that was incredibly successful. It fundamentally changed where many families ended up choosing to live. They chose to stay there. They really appreciated living in these new neighborhoods. It was very successful. So after doing that study, this was about 3-4 years ago, there was a bill proposed in Congress jointly by a Republican and Democratic senator to expand what we did in Seattle as a demonstration project to 10 other cities. They authorized $80 million of funding to do that. That bill was passed, and that demonstration is now happening in 9 other cities across America. Wow. But more importantly, there's just now been another bill introduced to expand the housing voucher program in the US by $5 billion per year, again co-sponsored by Republicans and Democrats, which people think has a reasonable chance of passing, to provide these additional supports, give vouchers to more people, all kind of in the service of increasing economic mobility. And so that's an example of how, an issue like economic opportunity, I think, can actually be uniting in the sense that most Americans think that your family background, where you happen to be born, should not determine your chances of success, whatever your views might be on inequality and so forth. And so an approach like this, which seems like it can make a difference on that, I actually think you can get lots of people to the table on making progress.
And so how long do you think you need to follow these people to then have the data that says actually this works?
Yeah, so what we were actually able to do, and I think the reason for the interest in this particular work is using historical efforts, something called the Moving to Opportunity experiment back in the 1990s in the Clinton administration, where families were encouraged to move to different areas using housing vouchers. We were able to go back to that historical data and show directly in a randomized experiment that the kids 25 years later who moved out of high poverty public housing projects in New York City to more mixed income neighborhoods in Queens, et cetera, are doing much better. That historical evidence combined with this current evidence on making the program more effective is the type of thing that I think really makes the case.
Right, that's great, that's great. So are you familiar with the, I don't know if you would call it a ranking tool, but a kind of college decision tool that the New York Times published recently? So to those of you who haven't seen it, it's worth having a look at, right? So it, rather than the thing everybody knows, the US News and World Report, which puts everything into a list, and that's appealing from a marketing standpoint, no doubt about it. But you're then not choosing the things that matter to you, right? If in the US News and World Report list, the list is by what they care about, what they think is important. And so this New York Times ranking tool lets you choose. I'm curious what you think about this as a way for people who are choosing colleges. Did they get the categories right? Does, what you think about it? Is there something they should add to it they don't have? I'd just love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I'm quite familiar with the tool. In fact, on the back end, it's using the data from our group that I just shared with you here. And so before they put it out publicly, they contacted us and said, what do you think? And are we getting this right? And so on. And I think it's a very useful approach. It's representative of a broader shift that we're seeing in these sorts of rankings, where even US News or Money Magazine, that does another one of these rankings, they're starting to put more weight on social mobility directly from the types of data our teams constructed and other such measures that the government is now putting out, which I think is a very useful shift, because in the past, I think there was almost a negative weight on social mobility, because if you put weight on things like the size of the endowment or contributions by alumni, you're basically favoring admitting more high-income children who may provide more resources, and it's going to go against, trying to move towards increasing social mobility. And so, while different people might have different views on what should get more weight and less weight, and I think the New York Times approach of letting people choose that is nice, I think an important shift that we're seeing in many different domains is actually paying attention to the outcomes I think colleges are meant to produce, which is create these pathways to opportunity. And I'm hopeful that that shift in the rankings will itself then change colleges' incentives, where there is a strong incentive to be ranked higher, you get more attention from students, you get more revenue, things like that. If we're actually putting weight on mobility, then it creates more of an incentive for colleges to focus on that. And I think that's an encouraging shift.
Great. All right, I want to be sure the audience has a chance to ask questions. So do we have mics? Yes, we have mics. And I think we're going to turn first to an old family friend.
Testing.
I don't know how empirically relevant the question is, you'll tell us. But going back to the early chart of Columbia and Stony Brook,
Yeah.
Stony Brook might look even better if we factor in that of the bottom 20% or the 20 percentile kids who apply, the ones with higher ability, if such a thing exists,
Yeah.
apply to Columbia. And so of that pool, we don't get the higher ability even. And I don't know if how significant this is. I don't even know if ability is, how to measure it, maybe SAT scores. So any response to that? No,
thanks for the question. So this is Pradeep Dubey, longtime family friend of ours. Great to see you here. Thank you. You're exactly right that the data that I presented here is just observational descriptive in the sense that we're just saying for the student body here, here's how well students do. What your question's getting at is what you would kind of like to know, maybe more relevant, is what's the value added of the institution holding fixed the abilities, so to speak, or the pre-college qualifications of the students on campus. It relates in some ways to what I was saying earlier about teacher value added and measuring the contribution of the teacher. Similarly, we want to measure the contribution of the college. Actually, it turns out this is precisely what some of our current research in this space is focused on. And just to give you an idea of how I think we can try to isolate that, we can look, for example, at students who narrowly get in to a place like Columbia, maybe off of the wait list, and compare that to kids who barely didn't get into Columbia, went to a different institution. You have many small experiments like that, and we're developing methods to aggregate those small natural experiments and directly measure the value added of each college. And your intuition is exactly right that the value added of certain institutions like Stony Brook is going to look even larger because Columbia and institutions like it have a very favorable selection of students. And so we're hoping to be able to put out those estimates publicly, which I think will even further strengthen the case for certain institutions and maybe change the case for others. Yeah.
I'll let her. And as you ask your question, will you please identify yourself for Professor
Thank
Chetty?
you. I'm Liliana Davalos. So there's economic historians who argue that a lot of political unrest that's tied with that lower mobility is the result of economic growth in the post-war 3 decades being about 4 or 5%, and then economic growth being more like 2 to 3% annual. I'm wondering, how do you connect these things to the observations that you saw, and which way the causality may go? Which one is the influence? Is it there's not enough growth because there isn't enough mobility, or there isn't enough mobility because there isn't enough growth?
Yeah, it's a great question. So coming back to that first chart that I showed, upward mobility, your chances of doing better than your parents declined from 90% to 50%. So exactly as you're suggesting, there are 2 reasons that might have happened. One is, as you noted, we have lower growth rates in the US economy. Of course, if total growth is lower, then fewer kids are going to be able to out-earn their parents. And it is a fact that in the United States, in the past 30 years, we've had lower growth rates than in the middle of the last century. It's about, in real terms, a 1 percentage point. I think best economic estimates suggest about a 1% lower annual growth rate. And so what we do in this paper, actually, the key part of the analysis is first establishing that fact, but then trying to understand what's driving it, distinguishing between the growth mechanism and the other possibility, which is greater inequality in the distribution of that growth. And so just to see why that might matter as well, take the extreme case where one person gets all of the additional growth. Say Bill Gates gets all of the additional money in the US over the past 30 years, just hypothetically. In reality, actually, we're not that far away from such an extreme distribution. But what's going to happen then is you will only have 50% of people doing better than their parents because one person is capturing all of the greater economic growth. So in the US, we've had lower growth rates in the past 30 years, but we've also had a much more unequal distribution of the growth, as you know, relative to in the middle of the last century, where we had more equitable growth or more inclusive growth. And so you can ask, how important are these two changes in driving the phenomenon that I described? And it turns out the answer is 2/3 is due to the more unequal distribution of growth, and 1/3 is due to the lower overall growth rates. And so it's really the stagnation of wages at the bottom of the income distribution that's the key thing that's leading to those lower levels of mobility, not that the economy as a whole is growing slower. Now, one final point in terms of the direction of causality, I think you're absolutely right that the lower levels of social mobility may themselves be leading to lower growth rates, which is connected to the last point that I was making with the patent data. Many people think that innovation is really the key driver of economic growth. If we're missing out on a lot of innovation because many people aren't having the opportunities to contribute, that's going to itself lead to lower growth rates, and the causality might run in the other direction for that 1/3.
That's great. Thank you. Well, we're at about out of time. I just thought I'd give you a second to maybe say, is there something about your future work and what you're planning to focus on that you'd like to share with the audience tonight?
Yeah, I mean, I think we hope we've made some progress in understanding these issues, but as I think you've seen, I'm sure a number of you have further questions, there's a lot that remains to be answered. And so what I'm excited about and encouraged by is I feel like we now have the data and some better tools to try to understand these questions. And I'm hopeful we're going to have more to say on what colleges can do to increase diversity and have greater impacts on economic mobility, what kinds of changes we can make in the elementary education system, in neighborhoods, and so on. And hopeful that there will be a receptive audience and policymakers, leaders of institutions, and so forth to take that and make changes going forward.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Chetty, to all the members of the audience. And please join me in a round of applause for our very special guest, Raj Chetty. And we will have a reception in the lobby, and I hope you will join us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.